So I actually went to Minioi as a kid, and in one of these strange instances of, let's see if this is better, if it's up here higher. Does that help you out, Kent? In one of those strange instances of never planning anything all the way here at Vox, my first story is actually a story from Minioi. So at Minioi, we slept in these very rustic cabins. They were called tabins. I don't know whether this is what Christine is planning on building or whether she's going to go like 1 or 2 steps up from that. But if you haven't seen a tabin, and I couldn't find a good picture of them, they are essentially a wood frame structure with just enough space in them for 2 sets of bunks down each wall and a little corridor down the middle. And they're simply framed, and then there's plywood put around the top, and they paint the plywood and stick some shingles on the roof, and then they put canvas tarps on the outside to cover the holes that they've cut in the plywood for the doors and the windows. And the tarps have string of rope through them, and you pull the rope, and theoretically you let in enough light to, be able to function by during the day, and hopefully you let out enough of the stink of 8 campers and all of their wet, dirty laundry from a week. Here's hoping. Anyway, these tabins, they were organized into sections at Minioi. They were the minis, and they were in this forest section, and the yos, and they were in this field section, and the wees were up the hill. Now, the minis and the yos, their bathrooms were sort of at one end of the section. You can kind of imagine it like one point on the compass of a circle. And so not very far away, not a big deal. But when I went to Minioi, the wee bathrooms were at the bottom of the hill, and the wees were at the top of the hill. Now, don't get me wrong. This was where the oldest campers slept. So it was a big deal to get to live on the hill. It was one of those coming of age moments, right? When you knew you were no longer a kid, but you had reached that pinnacle of maturity, and you were now a teenager. Come on, guys, it was exciting. It was so exciting. Unfortunately, what wasn't so exciting for me was that it wasn't super accessible for me to live on the hill. At the time I turned 13, I was still able to walk, but that didn't mean I could walk well. I wore leg braces and special shoes, and I got tired really easily, and I was in pain basically all the time. And so walking up this hill that was, a Muskoka hill with, the rocks into the side and the roots across and the stones that you could trip over, this was a great accessibility feature for me. You can see how that was going to work. And doing it multiple times a day, up and down the hill, that was not like ideal or awesome. The problem was, to make matters worse, I also was going through a phase where I was doing a lot of sleepwalking. You might be able to see where this is going. And so I would sleepwalk in the middle of the night at home. This was something that happened fairly frequently. My mom would tell me the stories of where she had found me and what she had found me doing, sleepwalking in the middle of the night. But one night when I was at camp, my mom wasn't there to find me when I woke up halfway down the hill in the dark. And I was not Roy. I did not grow up in the woods. I was not Nathan. I did not grow up in the woods. I was a very woods-ignorant girl in the dark who desperately needed to go to the bathroom. So I woke up, and I was in this process of trying to figure out where I was and sort of take account of what I had as assets in this moment, but I realized I didn't have any of those. I was in my nightgown without any shoes.
You were very close, that's good.
Well, okay, that was a start, okay. But there were no shoes, there were no braces, there was no flashlight, there were no lights on this path, there was no handrail on this path, there was nothing. I was out there in the dark, and I'm pretty sure it had rained earlier in the night because it was wet underfoot. Not only that, but There was no real clear lights going on above us. It was one of those cloudy nights when you couldn't see the moon and you couldn't see the stars. And because I hadn't consciously been awake from the beginning, I wasn't actually sure where on this path I was. I just knew that here I was, and I could barely see my hand in front of my face or my feet, much less the path in front of me. Now, feeling my way forward seemed the only option. I don't think it ever crossed my mind that since it was this dark, I could just pee and go back to my cabin. I don't think that had crossed as an option. So instead I felt my way forward one baby step at a time, gently, slowly, painstakingly, until after what felt like an excruciating distance and length of time, but was likely only a couple hundred of meters or so, I turned the corner of the path and I could see the edges of the security light attached to the bathroom. And I sighed with enormous relief. Now, nothing changed in that moment in terms of how dark it was outside. Right? The foliage was just as dense where I stood around the corner of that bend as it had been a meter back. But to my now dark, adjusted eyes, the world changed in an instant. I could see the stones, the roots, and the rocks under my feet. I could see the shape of my path, and I knew how close my destination was. In that moment, I went from scared and frightened to feeling like everything would be okay. All because of a single light. Our passage today has some things to say about light in the darkness. Unlike the last time, this time Nathan gave me just one verse, and it says this. Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. This is another one of Jesus's I am statements. We talked a few weeks ago about his statement of I am the bread of life, and this is the second one. I am the light of the world. So we know that this verse is talking about who Jesus is, his nature and his being, and what kind of message it is that he's bringing. On the surface, it seems pretty simple. Jesus is the light. You should follow the light. There won't be darkness. Then you'll have life. Sounds pretty good when you put it like that. And then you start holding it up to real life. And then I think there are a few questions we need to at least dig into. For example, although we seemingly left this phrase behind in 2021, the world continues to be a bit of a dumpster fire at the moment, don't you think? Like the war in Ukraine and the ongoing struggles of how we live with the most contagious endemic virus in history are the big stories dominating headlines at the moment, but all you need to do is to know that the world is dark, is to have a coffee with a friend or two, listen to the stories of a colleague at work, or some days simply scroll through social media. This week alone, my life included finding out about a friend who's a mom of teenagers who just received a new cancer diagnosis after having already had more than her fair share of challenges. Another friend who's walking through the early days of her son's recovery from one of the most aggressive brain surgeries imaginable, designed to hopefully arrest near constant seizures. And a number of friends trying to navigate the final few months and years of their elderly parents' lives, well, in spite of various family tensions. And that's just a small sampler of one person's week in one person's life. Many of those friends follow Jesus, and yet here they are, living in the midst of dark days. I've heard some amazing stories over the past few weeks about Ukrainian Christians and the way that they have been faithfully following Jesus, and that hasn't stopped their buildings being bombed. And I know lots of faithful Jesus-following people who have experienced all sorts of darkness as a result of COVID over the past 2 years. Economic darkness, mental health darkness, loss of loved ones, long-term disability, and relationship breakdowns have all caused a lot of darkness in our individual and collective worlds. The collective evidence suggests that following Jesus doesn't seem to have done much to stop us living in darkness. So before we get to any of the rest of the details of this passage, I think we need to clarify what Jesus is saying here. The world is dark. Jesus isn't promising that if we decide to follow him, we'll be magically pincer gripped by the back of our shirts from the darkness around us and plonked as if we were some roller coaster tycoon character into some ethereal, otherworldly land of angels on fluffy white clouds. That's not what it says. And when we assume that it does say that, we get ourselves into all sorts of trouble. Instead, what it promises is that if we follow Jesus, the light of the world, then we won't be in darkness, no matter how dark it is around us, because we will be in the presence of the light. Like the light on the outside wall of the bathroom at camp all those years ago did for me, the light will shine in the darkness, and we will therefore find a way through. I've got another nighttime camping story for you. Okay, so summer of, I think, 2014, Trevor and I decided we wanted to try backpacking. Maybe it was all those stories Nathan keeps telling over the years. I'm not sure, but let's put this in perspective. This was 2 years before I ended up in a wheelchair. We thought it would be a great idea to try to put our gear into packs and hike the Western Uplands Trail in Algonquin. Now, for starters, I should probably be clear, this was not a Nathan and Carrie backpack trail. The total trail distance of this loop was a mere 32 kilometers, and we had left a whole 4 days to try to do it. Still, that turned out to be wildly optimistic. We only managed 4 kilometers before we had to stop the first night because of delays in when we arrived. And after a day of steady drizzle that was simultaneously never enough to drive the mosquitoes for cover the second day, we ended at 1.5 kilometers with me wrenching my knee. And Trevor having to somehow carry both backpacks the last 1.5 kilometers to the next campsite while I limped my way in slowly and painfully. By the time we got set up in camp and some food into us, we were both done for the night. And with dark clouds rolling in, we went to bed before the sun, only to wake up in the middle of the night to a sound that I'm going to see if we can actually play. Now, if you know what it is, don't say. Keep it a secret. This was the sound we heard in the middle of the night. Now, many of you will know what it is. That's great. You're smart. You're clever. Remember Trevor and I, we're kind of city slickers. We're not the backwoods guys. We didn't grow up back there, and we did not recognize this sound. We knew what it wasn't. We knew it wasn't a bear, but we had no idea what it might have been. Was it a large moose? Was it something else that might come crashing through the clearing where we were? We had no idea. To make matters worse, those dark, ominous clouds that had gathered overhead had left it utterly pitch black. I have never been in darkness this dark outside before. When we tried looking outside, not only was there no moonlight and no starlight, we could not see the outlines of the trees. It was that dark. And we certainly couldn't see what was causing the noise, and worse yet, as the rain started, you guessed it, I had to go to the bathroom again. It's almost like that's a theme in my life. It's not an overstatement to tell you that Trevor and I were a bit terrified. I don't even feel ashamed about this in the slightest. There was clearly a very large, very active, very aggressive animal out in the utter pitch blackness of the space we were about to traverse through, and we had no idea what it was or how we could properly prepare ourselves. On top of that, I had taken some pretty substantial painkillers before going to bed that night. And although they were doing nothing for the pain, I'm pretty sure they were doing something up here. And it was a lot. I gave someone way too much power up there. So armed with only our raincoats, both of the flashlights we had brought, the toilet paper, and my walking sticks to support me, we set out carefully to the designated spot more than 50 meters from our campsite in the pouring rain. Somehow, we got there safely. Somehow, we got back safely. And somehow, we got a few more hours of sleep, in spite of the ongoing racket of whatever animal it was. When the dawn came, we had some breakfast, realized it was silly to continue on in our trip given the state of my knee, and began to pack up our kit in some way that would allow me to carry a minimal amount of weight as we tried instead to get back to the car that day. We set out slowly and carefully, and about 150 meters away from our campsite, we came across a small stream that was teeming with bullfrogs. I realized that our fear was entirely over-exaggerated. So what was that? They can be vicious, indeed.
This should be your story for how you ended up in the wheelchair.
If only. These were our terrifying creatures of the night. It was utterly ridiculous. In the broad light of day, why would we be afraid of them? In a human bullfrog competition, I think even I would probably come out victorious. And yet, the darkness distorts what we see and hear, doesn't it? It changes how we understand our world, our perceptions of time and distance and noises. Sometimes the darkness distorts things in ways that make us scared about things that we don't need to be scared about, but sometimes the darkness also distorts things in ways that make us think that certain actions are a really good idea when they really, really aren't. Sometimes the darkness makes us think that friends are really enemies, or that enemies are really friends. It can make us forget the promises that we made, the goals that we outlined, the hopes and possibilities we once held so optimistically to, or the life we were hoping to live. In other words, the darkness makes it so much easier for us to sin, to live into the human propensity to fuck things up, doesn't it? Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So, if the world is a dumpster fire of darkness, and the darkness distorts our perceptions of reality, but Jesus is the light of the world, why wouldn't we all be actively holding on to Jesus as hard and as tight as we could to make sure we stayed with this light of the world? Time for another story. Now, full disclosure, before I tell this story, I just have to preface it to say I think it's only fair to my mother to say that this is not something that would ever have happened at my mother's house. She raised me better than this, but there you go. Maybe it's not the type of story that would ever happen at your house either, but sadly, probably because of the world is full of darkness and sin, this is the type of story that happens on a semi-regular basis at our house. It's a story of leftovers. It's a story about what happens sometimes to leftovers that people put into the containers and then put in the fridge and then forget about. It's a story about all of the people who open and close the fridge door, all of the times they move that container out of the way to get something that's behind it, and it gets shoved a little further and further and further back in the fridge. I know none of you have this happen at your house. I know. But at my house, it's a story about the way I see that container and have a vague suspicion that it's been in the fridge for longer than is strictly speaking healthy or helpful. But I don't have the energy or on this particular day or this particular time to deal with said container, and so it sits there and sits there and sits there until I know that there is no other way for it. There is no one else who is going to do this job. If there were, they would have done it already. They have had plenty of time, but they haven't. And so, I take a deep breath and I reach into the fridge and I pull out the container. Now, I'm not the one who typically does the dishes at our house. I usually do the cooking, and Trevor is awesome, and he usually does the dishes. And at this point, there is a temptation to put the container on the side of the counter and hope that he will deal with it. But honestly, this trick only works sometimes. You see, because in fact, the container is still strictly speaking closed. And so while it has entered the dishwashing preparation area of our house, it has not been fully initiated into the dishwashing preparation rituals that constrain this section of the house and include open and empty containers. And so sometimes the container will continue to sit by the side of the sink for not one, not two, but even more dishwashing cycles. And the showdown continues. Who will crack first? The answer varies, but at some point, one of us will take a deep breath, hold the offending container as far from our bodies as possible, open it as closely to the edge of the compost bin as we can, and turn away. Sometimes what comes out is slimy. Sometimes what comes out is moldy. Often what comes out is unrecognizable. You may be sitting there thinking, you could have dealt with that weeks ago and it would never have got to that point, you know. I know. But that isn't the point here, is it? The more the container hides at the back of the dark fridge, the less we want to deal with it. And it's not just food that's like that, is it? There are some things in our life that we don't want to look at. There are some things we've hidden away in the dark that we don't want anyone to know about. They make us feel ashamed. They make us feel like not only have we done something bad, but maybe that we, deep in ourselves, are bad. And the more that feeling is allowed to grow, the harder it is to get through it to the other side, isn't it? The problem is, if we are full of this kind of shame, and if we convince ourselves that it would be our undoing if someone noticed us, then the darkness starts to look like a great place to hang out. The light that maybe to other people feels warm and comforting starts to feel harsh and invasive to us. Because if the light gets too close, our shame might be revealed. And we worry that this will be our undoing. So we start to actively avoid the light. The longer it goes on, the more putrid all this shame gets, the more toxic it becomes to us and the people around us. What was initially intended to hide our sinfulness actually becomes the source of more and more sinful actions as we try everything we can to avoid thinking about what we have done. And the further down this road we go, the harder it gets to think about taking the lid off and letting the light in. Again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have light of life. When we're out in the dark, it can be easy to mistake one light that's a long way off with another. But unfortunately, just because they're both lights doesn't mean they're created equally. Late yesterday, Chinese officials confirmed that all 132 people aboard flight MU-5735 had died after their plane traveling from Kunming to Guangzhou Monday crashed into a heavily forested area of the Guangxi region. Investigators continue to search for the second black box, and it will no doubt spend months piecing through the evidence and the wreckage to determine the crash. They've found it, but there's much investigation left to go. And it's work that researchers have been doing ever since the earliest days of flight, every time a plane comes down, right? They try always to understand the causes of airline crashes so that they can prevent them from happening again in future. This is how come airline travel keeps getting safer and safer. And this week I found an old article from 1947 in the US Navy's cumulative reference papers. In it, the Navy was reporting on the research that they were doing on the way that they light planes, and more importantly, why this research was so crucial for their work. Unsurprisingly, problems with flying in the dark had constantly dogged the Navy during World War II, but the problems weren't limited just to enemy aircraft or anti-aircraft missiles, and they weren't primarily based around navigating in relationship with the ground even. The problem seemed to be more to do with understanding how to properly identify each other so that they could stay in good relationship with one another up in the air in the dark. Airplane pilots were trained at the time to fly in formation with one another for protection and as part of their military strategies. But at night, according to the report, pilots often attempted to fly formation on a star or crashed due to failure to correctly identify or distinguish between ground lights and the lights of other planes. One Navy student pilot, for instance, was flying over the Texas desert at night and mistakenly tried to join up in formation with an oil truck, thinking it was the port wing light of another plane. So here's the thing. There are lots of things out there that twinkle and shine, lots of things that catch our eyes and try to pretend that they're the light that's going to lead to life. They promise great things if only we follow them. Safety, fulfillment of our purpose, the happiness of ourselves and our families, wealth, and more. As an aside, that last one's a sure giveaway. Jesus definitely will never promise that one as the light beacon. It's never going to be wealth, guys. We're going to talk about this more again in a few weeks, but for the purposes of today, it's still important for us to realize that Jesus isn't a light of the world. Jesus is the light of the world. No matter how much the other ideas sparkle, what Jesus is saying here is that if we want all the benefits that light brings, if we don't ever want to walk in darkness but want to have the light of life, then the only light worth following is going to be Jesus. We have to do what he says we should do. Examine our choices and actions in the light of his teachings, and even be willing to get vulnerable with Jesus about the shameful parts of our lives so that those can get cleaned up. This is where we start to see the life at the end of this verse blossom and grow. This is where we start to experience freedom from our shame, renewed relationships, hope for our future. What life looks like for each of us will be different in some of its details, but this idea that Jesus' light will bring life isn't some ethereal statement. I want you to leave this morning, if you leave with nothing else, this idea of life is a tangible, practical, testable, knowable statement. In Galatians 5:22 and 23, we read about the fruit of the Spirit. That is the things that will start to show up in our lives more and more as we walk in the light of life that is Jesus. These fruit include more love and joy, peace and patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. We don't get these things by gritting our teeth or trying harder. And they aren't things that bloom in the darkness, but they are very, very real. We can actually mark our progress at walking in the light by how much these things are present in our lives. We can test out whether the things that we're doing are helping us become more loving and joyful, more peaceful and patient. If we need to, we can check with people around us to find out whether they are experiencing a kinder, more good, more gentle, more faithful, more self-controlled person when they spend time with us. If they are, great. It doesn't matter how slow that change is coming. That is what we are after. But if they are not, then maybe what we've found that we thought was Jesus' light is just a twinkly reflection. And we should take a moment and shift what we've pinned our sights onto. Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. When I was a kid, my brother's biggest complaint about me was that I was bossy. I was the big sister. And I was convinced that I knew how things should go and how we should do things. And more important, I wasn't any good at trusting that my baby brother knew how things should go. And I wasn't just bossy when it came to my interactions with my brothers. My brother, I only had one. He was a lot, but he was only one. And since many of you have known me for many years, now I know you'll be shocked when I tell you that this wasn't just a problem for me when I was a kid. The reality of my own sinfulness is that my anxiety leads immediately to a desire to control. My environment, my schedule, and the people around me are all at risk in these moments of being the target of that control when things get bad. So I guess it's not hugely shocking that when, at the end of a long and difficult semester, when I was faced with a couple of weeks ago with a group project whose grade was crucial to me qualifying for a full tuition scholarship next year, that's exactly what I found myself doing. 3 weeks out. Let's try to get everyone in the group in the same Zoom room to at least talk about what the plan is. 2 weeks out. Let's make sure we've all read the book and agree on what the thesis is. 1 week out. Let's be clear about what parts each of us are responsible for. My poor classmates. They were drowning in work that was due in the intervening weeks for all of their other classes, but with everything I was holding on to, this was my coping mechanism. To try and control the process in the hopes that I could somehow control or at least positively influence the outcome. So given that this is part of my own sinfulness that I have wrestled with on a regular basis, you can guess that I don't necessarily love the final thing I have to say about this light. But that doesn't mean it's not true. You see, we don't get to control this light of Jesus. We can't contain it. We can't master it. We can't separate it from Jesus and take it off in our own direction to do with what we want. We're all different, and the things each of us struggle with, though, may be different. Maybe for you, control isn't the big issue, and maybe for you, the issue is more consistency. Maybe for you, the challenge will be that if we want to access this light, it's not enough to come to it one day and then wander away the next day. Instead, there's this sense in this verse that we get access to the light by following Jesus in this present, continuous, ever ongoing sense of the word. Maybe the challenge for you is something else entirely again. Whatever the case, the point is that following Jesus is going to require that we die to ourselves. It's an old-sounding religious phrase, and it's been used in all sorts of negative ways over the years, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have anything for us today. At its best, this phrase, it gets at this idea that if we decide that following Jesus is more important than carrying on with our normal ways of doing life and even of engaging with God, we don't come to Jesus to get Jesus to rubber stamp all of our actions, and we don't get a little Jesus pendant to hang from our rearview mirror pendant as a talisman for life. What we get is the invitation to set aside all of the ways we naturally would find ourselves doing things and instead choose to follow Jesus, wherever Jesus leads, into the fullness of life. Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. If you want to skip the next slide, I guess the next 2 slides. This is the statement. This is the promise. Jesus is the light of the world. There will be darkness, but if you follow him, you will have the light of life in the midst of that darkness. This is the statement and promise that's here for us this morning. If we feel like we're overwhelmed by the darkness, if we feel like we've had our perceptions twisted and distorted, and we've made choices we regret or maybe even feel ashamed about, then the invitation is here this morning to come back to the light. Not just any old twinkly light, but the light of Jesus. Don't try to control it or manipulate him, but learn to walk in Jesus' light and come experience what life to the full looks like. If the worship team can come back up, I'll pray.